The floor is open to questions. And we have the first question, Brigadier General Amin Akbar from Bangladesh.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brigadier General Amin Akbar. It's been a pleasure to be here. And let me first thank Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka Army for wonderful hospitality. On behalf of all the foreign delegates here, probably will not get a chance to do that again. My question relates to smaller and developing nations across the globe, especially the scope and the challenges and the strategic choices they have. The smaller and developing nations neither have appetite or don't need conflict or competition. They have everything to gain from cooperation. But then there are so many geo-economical enticement or geopolitical pressures these smaller nations face. I would like to know from you what are the choices or even the scope of cooperation between the smaller nations. Is it time to seek refuge to the concept of non-aligned movement in this age of global disorder? Thank you.
Who would like to take Dr. Brahman?
I think I can take that. Yeah. So just make a couple of notes. Okay. So you've asked a very interesting question, and if I understand it correctly, what you're really asking is, when faced with a choice to take assistance or become part of a coalition or maybe fall into the sphere of influence of a larger power that has more resources, what are the risks or what are the trade-offs that a government has to face when agreeing to certain terms or when taking on assistance that may come with certain strings? That's how I'm interpreting your question. There's no easy answer to that question. I would say that one of the challenges for the 21st century for all states, but especially for smaller states, is recognizing that there is a spectrum of choices that political leaders, civilians, and military officers, senior military officers especially, will have to make. And probably one of the best courses of action is to think about the kind of specialization that a small state can undertake. And if small states are looking to maintain some kind of non-aligned status, if they're not looking to seek admission to a sphere of influence, can they identify partners, informal or formal partners, to create coalitions to actually share resources, whether those resources are human capital, intelligence, military assets, training, educational opportunities. It's going to require initiative on the part of small states to approach the problem in those terms. But I think there's a possibility that states can identify what their strengths are, focus their resources and their intellectual and human capital development on those resources, and then identify partners who are in a similar situation who have chosen different specializations. Would you like to answer that?
Yeah, should I? Yeah, next question, Major General Munir from Bangladesh.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. My question is directed to the second speaker, Dr. Karadeli, if I can pronounce it rightly. What I'm asking you is that we all understand that the Asia-Pacific region doesn't have an established security architecture. But at the same time, several attempts and trends are emerging as countries and groups of countries try and craft an architecture for the Asia-Pacific region. In particular, I'm referring to the Indo-Pacific strategy. I'm also referring to BRI. I would like to know your opinion, how these attempts might shape the architecture in the near future? And what are the other attempts, like, as the chair mentioned, the role of ASEAN, for example, or what would be the role of ATMM and ADMM Plus? There are several Track 1.5 initiatives that are ongoing at the moment, like the Xiangshan Forum in Beijing or the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. What sort of influence and attempts are being shaped in shaping the security architecture?
How it contributes to Asia Pacific. And how it contributes to the stability and all that in the Asia Pacific region.
Thank you for the question. I was actually trying to understand, because it was a very long question. I didn't really understand what you were focusing when following it. It was a bit difficult. I must confess that I am not an expert in the Asian Pacific. I'm an expert of the Middle East. However, while preparing for this seminar and at the same time doing my research on my own expertise subject as well, and while researching for the relation that I could find in between the EU and Asia Pacific, your question regarding the Asian infrastructure, or you said something like architecture and its role towards the Asia Pacific, I think this is kind of a debatable topic. And it depends from which perspective you look into. What kind of architecture you're looking into. If you're looking into security, that's definitely going to have to look at the threats and at the way every single threat can be tackled. If you look into economy, that would be the way economic partnerships and common advantages could be obtained. If you look at, I don't know, any other political diplomacy, for every single one, I think that might be an option. But this can only be reached through cooperation, and this can only be reached through negotiation and intense discussions.
Thank you. Now, next question is from Staff Colonel Ayman Farouk Taha from Egypt.
Thanks so much. My question to Mr. Nilanthane. I have been following you too much. You have been mentioning all the conflicts except marriage conflict. And from this, I'm lucky to live the generation that we witness Taliban in two roles, evil Taliban and good Taliban. My question is, from this, are we going to witness the good rule of ISIS?
So the good rule of ISIS where? In this region or?
No, you mentioned that some other countries have a meeting with Taliban now just to wait for their, if sometime they will be trusted. So from this, I'm asking my question, if in some upcoming years, after 10, 20 years,
Yeah.
there will be some other countries will have a meeting with such a terrorist organization?
I think that's a great question, and I think that's one of the sort of fundamental criticisms of the peace process in Afghanistan right now, which is that essentially you are making the non-state actor that you've been at war with one of the legitimate stakeholders in the sort of ultimate conclusion of a conflict. And as you say, what will stop somebody, let's say 15 years from now, claiming that negotiating with ISIS, reaching a settlement with the Islamic State is the only way for us to have peace, and therefore we concede to that. I am on principle against negotiating with non-state actors, particularly when they get to a certain scale. But I think we have to admit that the global consensus right now is more towards reconciliation and taking a softer approach and sort of a hearts and minds and a population-centric approach to things. But I completely share your concerns. If if they do negotiate with the Taliban and they do reach a sort of conclusion which is satisfactory for them, what guarantee do we have that this is a conclusion with a reliable party? None. And what guarantee do we have that we wouldn't go down a slippery slope? None. So I completely agree with your concern. And it's very possible it might happen. I mean, who knows where, the sort of human rights journey will take us in world politics. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question is from Major General RWW ADB Rajaguru from Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Dr. Andrea. Doctor, the dilemma in Europe or West after the ISIS or Daesh is about the how to face foreign trained fighters, returnees of foreign trained fighters, their families, then how to take the judicial actions, and finally how to integrate them into the society. However, dilemma in South Asia is different to it, because our worry is whether they will shift into South Asia and whether they will have a foothold in South Asia to continue with their destructive activities. So, according to your studies, do you think that this will materialize in South Asia? Will there be any IS or the Daesh related activities happening in South Asia in future?
Thank you very much for the question. Actually, yesterday we were discussing this in a training, and I would like to begin with the fact that the foreign terrorist fighter is definitely not a new phenomenon. It's been here for a long while, and we've witnessed it in history. So we can draw some patterns. The real threat of a foreign terrorist fighter starts when the conflict is over, at least when it's, for example, for this particular context, when the territory is not there anymore, when Daesh is defeated in terms of territorial space. So now it's when the FTF, foreign terrorist fighters, become a real threat. That's because they actually have three options. They can either die. There are some estimates that great numbers of them have died during the battles. They can travel to their origin country, and that's very difficult. Or they can go to a third country, exploiting the power vacuum, stability vacuum, and other sectarian lines or whatever conflicts they can exploit in those areas. Actually, your question is based on very good information that there have been foreign terrorist fighters that have been sent to various regions, and it is South Asia, it is Asia Pacific, it's the whole Asia. That's because, if you really want to fight with a terrorist, you have to listen and understand to what they say. Daesh has been talking about this very openly since the beginning. Al-Nani went out and say, if you want to fight for us from home. So that was the moment when they not only asked their sympathizers not to join them in Syria and Iraq, but they also started to send their foreign terrorist fighters, like some of the people that they could trust and that they had training given to various different lands, various different regions, and Southeast Asia was one of them. Then you were asking also about Europe and the fact that there are also foreign terrorist fighters that we're not coming back, or they're coming back and a threat for Europe, I suppose, right? Actually, there's another threat that we haven't been looking into, and it's the fact that apart from those FTFs that travel to a third place, and they're definitely an asset for the organization, a threat for that country, as it is in the case of a sleeper cell. There's also the threat of the foreign terrorist fighters and their families who are now in prisons in Iraq and Syria. And that's because there is no real security in those prisons. They are a true environment for radicalization, and further on, there are the perfect context for obtaining a future ISIS 2.0 generation made out of the kids that are now in these facilities. So there are very, very different dimensions of this FTF phenomenon, and I do agree with you, there is information that they have been traveling to different places, Southeast Asia being one of them, but unfortunately there is no, especially for a person who's analyzing open source information, it is very hard to find numbers and identities. So the only thing you can do, analyze on, that would be, open source estimations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So
then?
I think the threat of an IS presence here, an expanding IS presence here, is not only real but very urgent for one main reason. They have to move somewhere. So Raqqa and Mosul have typically been the heartland of ISIS control in the Middle East, and this year has been a pretty destructive year for them in terms of losing geographic space. So once they lose geographic space, they will have to look at an evolution of their methods. They will have to look at new places. They will have to look at certain political factors. I mean, if you look at the IS literature and what they actually say, in 2014, 15, 16, it was all about come here for the holy struggle, come here to fight. The last 2 or 3 years, that has not materialized at all. The last 2 years, including the recent sort of resurfacing of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, what they say is no longer come here. What they say is continue your struggles where you are. Take your struggles to your homelands, because the cause here is lost. So I think even the Islamic State itself recognizes that they do need to shift their operations. Will it be sort of pseudo-conventional warfare the way that it is in the Middle East? Unlikely. But as far as a shift goes, I think South Asia is a sort of prime target for their sort of next move, their next geopolitical move.
Thank you. Our next question is from Dr. Chulani Attanayaka.
Thank you for very interesting presentations for all the panelists. I have 2 questions, if I may. The first one is about the technological factors or the technological warfare. We are talking about South Asia and particularly in Sri Lanka, where we have a very limited budget to allocate for defense. So in a context where technological warfare is emerging at a very rapid scale, what options developing countries like Sri Lanka has in countering this threat? My second question is specifically to Nilan, because you talked about the refugees and climate change. Right now we see refugee inflows mainly because of traditional conflicts and conventional warfare, but climate change will bring a huge amount of refugees in the future. In your opinion, to what extent South Asia is ready to face this challenge? Thank you.
Yeah. So if I could answer that question in reverse, so I completely agree that we do need to be geared up for environmental refugees. Now, for example, even with the Rohingya refugees, right, one thing we do need to keep in mind is that while a large chunk of them are fleeing political circumstances, a conflict and all that, about a third of them are fleeing about a third of them are environmental refugees, fleeing floods and things like that. So are we really prepared for it? I would think not. Typically, South Asia has had, I would say, a pretty good track record in terms of being open to our neighbors who come in as refugees, large Afghan refugee population in Pakistan, Sri Lankan Tibetan refugee populations in India, almost 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. So typically, we do have a good track record on the sort of compassion side in terms of accepting refugees in. But are we logistically prepared for it? I'm not too sure. In terms of your first question, what do we do considering the fact that some of us don't have big defense budgets and things like that? The flippant answer would be increase the defense budget, but of course that would be a sort of casual remark which is which can't really be sustained, I suppose. But it's something that we do need to consider. I mean, we cannot, the hallmark of unconventional warfare is that we have the technological advantage. Right? The state has the technological advantage, which the non-state actor now has to use a variety of different techniques to counter. But when we look at emerging technologies, especially in the 21st century, there's a huge chance that even the non-state actor might have a technological advantage over us. If the non-state actor is a proxy of a more developed state, right, that non-state actor is likely to have, let's say, autonomous technology, biological enhancements, there are artificial intelligence. There are so many different new avenues that would open up. So we must not be in that position. So, which is why, once again, as the keynote speaker mentioned, often the big question is there synergy between the political vision of a country and the security objectives, right? So when there is synergy there, I think many of these problems will be automatically solved.
Thank you. Dr. Brown?
And I would add to that, following on the question that was asked earlier, that seeking out partnerships has a lot of value for countries that don't have the resources that larger, more wealthier states enjoy. And I want to reiterate this point because, yes, we're living in a period of history where there are lots of new emerging technologies that could fundamentally jeopardize the sovereignty of the states that we take for granted. But at the same time, there are lots of technologies that are exploitable at relatively low cost that states that don't have a large resource pool can take advantage of. They can specialize, they can work together. The challenge that you have, whether you're talking about a large state or a small state, is that within any political constituency, you're going to find people who see value in having a close relationship with a stronger, more powerful state, and you're going to see people who would prefer that their state retain its sovereignty, remain non-aligned, find ways to work around the threats and challenges that are identified by their strategic planners. There's a medium to be found somewhere in between. And I can give you a specific example that I would ask all of you to think about. In your military communities, in your defense establishments, in your intelligence communities, what work are you doing to exploit open source intelligence resources? The world is replete with OSINT. There are a lot of resources that countries with very limited resources can exploit to get an understanding of the strategic situation within their countries, the domestic political situation, to understand the regional security situation. Not many states are taking advantage of the fact that there is so much information available out there because we're not training people to assess that information, to process it, and to package it for policymakers. So life is about trade-offs. Every state going forward is going to be facing these kinds of challenges, but there are resources available in the world today that states that have in the past really struggled to harness resources, to deploy resources in support of national security or the protection of sovereignty. Those resources are available now if you have creative, smart people who are willing to take risks with the technology that's available to them. My final point is really just on being careful about IT investment, infrastructure investment, technology investment. Be very careful about your vendors. Be very careful about the capabilities that you are adopting. Be mindful of the fact that with every new technology, you're embracing vulnerability. And make sure that your strategic planners, make sure that your operational security personnel understand the vulnerabilities that are inherent in any system that you may choose to adopt. Whether it's a communication system or a payroll system, all of these things are exploitable. And it's only a matter of time before someone figures out a way to exploit the system. Do you have redundancies? Do you have a backup? Are there systems in place to protect what you've built? These are the kinds of questions that planners need to be thinking about now as they develop the resources to deploy technology.
Thank you. Next question is from Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Chowdhury from Bangladesh.
Many thanks, Chair. The question is actually addressed to Mr. Nilanthan, but of course anyone on the podium can sort of jump in to react. In your excellent remarks, you have, I think, referred to, as I understood it, the fact that the two major protagonists in South Asia are in possession of nuclear capabilities. It has not, in effect, prevented conflict at conventional levels. Now, recently we have been hearing some hints about changes in the doctrinal changes, particularly with regard to no first use. Now, the question is, if this comes to pass, of course, in your opinion, does it lower the nuclear threshold and enhance the possibilities of the breakdown of deterrence, which would be, of course, very worrisome for all of us? Thank you.
Thank you. In my personal opinion, I don't think the actual risk of nuclear warfare is as serious as it looks from a cursory glance, because I think both India and Pakistan understand that in today's world, your nuclear weapons are useful only as long as you threaten to use them without using them. The instant you use your nuclear weapons, your entire arsenal is now essentially useless, because you have now antagonized the entire world. Because if one of the parties do perpetrate some kind of large attack which kills a large number of people, that's a large number of customers that are lost, that's a large number of citizens who have been lost. In today's interconnected economy, I don't think any business entity or even a regional entity will stand for a large chunk of even the middle class, let's say, being wiped out. So, and the other reason I don't think the sort of nuclear factor will come into play pretty soon is because I think nuclear weapons, and once again, this is not a there's not an opinion shared in the security community, but I think nuclear weapons will become redundant very soon. I think, as I was mentioning in my presentation, we're just waiting for a 9/11 moment or a Hiroshima moment with some new aspect of technology. This could be biological technology, it could be space, it could be artificial intelligence, but when that major attack comes, all of a sudden our security calculations will be based on this new technology that's come up. So I think the days of nuclear energy being our primary determinant in the security calculations, I think it's coming to an end. It's inevitable that it will come to an end soon.
But I share some sentiments of Dr. Chowdhury, because the Cold War type of deterrence which existed at that time between the Soviet and the US is no longer there now, and therefore we cannot really rule out the possibilities. It's a complicated situation, and therefore we can, agree.
Sure. It's unlikely. It's unlikely, in my opinion.
Our next question is from Major General So Obanji from Nigeria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And actually that's going to be our last question, because I have to wind up this session by 12:35. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for allowing me to share my own perspective on this issue. My question is actually on the problems confronted by most countries that are fighting violent extremism in their own country. There is also always this accusation from other non-state actors on the issue of violation of human rights. But our problem has always been, how do you balance issue of national security imperatives with concerns for human rights when you are faced with this kind of problem? Thank you.
You want to?
Thank you. Actually, it's been a long time since we are asking how do we balance regional stability, or let's say it straight, how do you balance security with liberties? So that's almost like it touches on the same subject. How do you balance counterterrorism, and how do you balance stability with human rights? That's very hard, and I'm pretty familiar with what you were referring to. I have conducted some research together with researchers from Nigeria on the evolution of the conflict there. And I can tell you that although human rights should be a common concept or understanding for everyone, unfortunately it is not. And this is the case not only for human rights, this is the case for the most important concepts that we're talking about, and terrorism is one of them. Extremism is one of them. Radicalization is one of them. The perception that I would have on radicalization, the perception on what we have, the perception that I would have on a basic human right might be different from the perception that someone from another corner of the world would have. So honestly, I think this is going to take a lot of time, a lot of discussion, and a lot of debate on how you can balance those. And it's not something that can be, it's not a secret formula to do it. You want my opinion? I'm a supporter of intercultural communication. I'm a supporter of cultural awareness. I think that if we raise our children in the spirit of a cultural awareness, in the spirit of intercultural communication, that would be the key for having to stabilize between those. This is my personal opinion. This is a long-term strategy, and it's more like a personal strategy. But in terms of, military or any other political diplomatic strategies, I think this is, I'm not the right person to answer that. And it's still a long road ahead for that. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me give some time for the speakers if you want to make any last minute observations.
So I would ask, as each of you head out to lunch or in the coming days, to think about some of the issues that we've touched on in the panel here. My own personal interest is in education. It's in professional military education. It's in societal education. And it's a point that I've made in many other venues where I've had the opportunity to talk about social media, radicalization, the influence of this sort of artificial reality that some people are living in today because of their exposure to media, the ecosystem that we live in. It's imperative that states start thinking about how to reform their educational systems to discourage people from accepting at face value information that may be deceptive, that may misinform them, or that may lead them down the path of radicalization. That begins very early. That can't begin in secondary school. That can't begin in university. And it's something that I think we're facing as a generational challenge. And there's evidence of this all around the world. So I would ask you to think about that as you move on in your careers, and if you have the opportunity to influence people in the educational field, especially in the civilian side, please take the time to talk to them. So thank you.
Yeah, so I'd just like to, instead of closing remarks, just quickly answer two questions that were asked. In terms of the last question on how do we strike a balance between human rights and counterterrorism, the unfortunate truth might be that we can't. We can pretend to do so, but let's not, the laws of war were formed in the 1940s. There has been no significant reform to the laws of war since 1977. We are about a generation or two behind legally. People don't fight wars the way that they did in the 40s, and therefore it's almost impossible now to use the current legal regime for the sort of for any counterterrorism campaign. In terms of the first question that I didn't get to answer, which was what do small states do? Don't they have everything to gain by becoming a part of a bigger bloc or a non-aligned movement? I think small states, I would disagree with that. I would say small states have a lot to lose by becoming a huge, a small cog in a huge machine. I'm once again not a big fan of the sort of non-aligned mentality. I think that's something that larger countries can afford to adopt, but in today's day and age, I think it would be better for smaller countries to pick a side, because that makes our strategic options a lot easier, and it makes it it makes our own vision a lot clearer.
Thank you. Yes.